First of all, don't worry. I mean, the one thing I know on a hot day is when somebody comes to the microphone with a whole sheet full of papers, you think, crikey, how long is he going to take? Actually, it's only the first of these sheets of papers that contain my notes for today. And since, and Teresa slightly anticipated this, since I won't be able to stay for the whole day, I will try and leave a few minutes within my slot to have a bit of discussion or any questions. But I wanted to, and I also should apologise for not having, it really makes me feel guilty when Anne has a PowerPoint to do her introduction and I haven't got a PowerPoint to make any comments. So it does mean the bad news is you'll have to listen. Or alternatively look at Anne's cat if that seems to be a desirable alternative. I did also want to start by echoing what has been said about the success of this organisation. In fact, I'm staggered to know this is the 7th meeting. I was actually going to ask when I got here, was it the 4th or 5th? But the fact that it's been going for 7 years shows a degree of durability and commitment, and I think that Publishers for Development is turning out to be one of those initiatives that we all dream about. It's one of those practical initiatives that really doesn't take a huge amount of investment, although I do know that a lot of time has gone into it, but which can lead to real change. It's really one of those things that organisations like ours and universities and development agencies dream about. My brief here is to say a little bit about the way things are changing in universities from the perspective of the ACU. As many of you know, we have something like 540, 550 member universities spread throughout the Commonwealth. About 2/3 of them are in developing countries. More in Asia, over half of those are in Asia, over 100 are in Africa. I imagine that there may be a tendency in what I say to talk a little bit more about Africa than Asia. I think that's a tendency we must all try and resist a little bit because there has been so much attention placed on Africa in recent years. But nonetheless, I think that what I'm saying will have some applicability to both. And I want to preface this with a kind of caveat, really, because I think we all know that things are changing. And I think, and particularly in the environment that many of you guys work in, this won't be a very new thing for me to say. I think we all know that we live in an age where we increasingly have a danger of too much data, too much information, rather than too little. And the danger now is kind of discriminating and distilling that information rather than accessing it in the first place. And in that environment, I'd like to sort of say that I think it's actually rather curious how little we know about what is happening in the sector on a day-to-day basis. I mean, there are many, many global studies, some of which I'll refer to. But actually, what I want us to think about here is what happens within the organizations and what happens actually within the mind of the individual who is working in a developing country university at the moment. So crudely speaking, what do we know? Well, we know that higher education is a growth industry. That is without doubt true. It's true in Asia, it's true in Africa, it's true in the rest of the world to a lesser extent. And we know that it will continue to grow, and we know that the vast bulk of that growth for the next 20 years will be in developing countries rather than developed ones. From the point of view of an organisation like the ACU, it is in fact one of our great difficulties to keep up with that growth, even at a crude level. Every time I go to India or Nigeria, I ask somebody how many universities are there now, and it always seems to be 10 or 20 or 30 more than there were last time. We also know, again in a very crude sense, that resources are not keeping up with that investment. We know that the staff-student ratios are getting lower by the minute, and that things are getting more problematic. That in itself may or may not be a problem. We are told regularly that the private sector is riding to the rescue, and we are told regularly that new teaching methods are also helping greatly. Both of those two things, I'd like to say, have an element of truth in them. I don't actually think higher education could survive without those two phenomena. I'll question a little bit later how much we actually know about how far they are working in practice and how they're working in practice. But the bigger danger, actually, even to investment not keeping pace with demand, the bigger danger, it seems to me, is that expectations are rising constantly. And we don't have very many surveys, but most of the surveys we see show that students, and perhaps equally importantly their parents, are expecting the advantages of higher education in the labour market to be pretty similar to what they were 20 or 30 years ago. Now, this is a real danger. If you look at the experience that we've had in the UK, and most of you, I think, will know more about that in Africa, the fact is that being a graduate now isn't quite what it used to be, if I can say that, in my day. And I won't tell you exactly when my day was. The other thing we know is that the expectations of university research are rising. First of all, we haven't quite abandoned the idea that everyone should be doing research. That may be an idea we should abandon. Let's look at that a bit later. But we do know that those who do research are surrounded by an increasing sea of expectations. First of all, research, and one can argue about how far down this track developing countries are compared with the UK, but we do know that research is becoming more competitive, more project funded, more short-term perhaps in its nature. That isn't so much the case in, say, India, Asia, Africa, as it has become in the UK, but it is moving clearly in that direction. The days when academics would inherit a pot of time and a pot of money in which they could do research freely over the long term are declining. We see in Africa the very positive growth of things like research councils, which DFID and IDRC and welcome our funding now. This is all good. This is all saying let's identify the research that can have best effect, let's prioritize research, let's make it a competitive business, but it is also putting more and more demand on the researcher. Added to which, from within the institution, there is the demand to be more financially savvy, to be more legally savvy. From within the profession, there is the demand to be more ethically aware. And from the law, there is a demand to meet an increasing range of regulations such as environment and so on. And more than anything, from funding bodies, there is a desire to have impact. So let's look at this from the point of view of the researcher who is inundated with an increased, perhaps, teaching load, an increased institutional administrative load, and is now finding that research is itself deeply, which for many, I hope, will still be a key motivation, is under huge pressure. So I think it's a dangerous combination. We can argue about how far down the road we are. I should have said at the start, in the UK, there is a standard joke, my apologies for anyone, everyone I expect who's heard it, to describe the way in which higher education has changed in the last 30 years. It goes like this. When I entered higher education 30 years ago, and this is true in my case actually, I became an administrator fairly quickly, being far too useless or impatient to be an academic. And one of the first things I did, interestingly in this environment, was I was given the job of being secretary to the libraries committee of my institution. And I, very proudly, showing my efficiency, organised the first meeting of the Libraries Committee for the, I think the third Wednesday afternoon in October. And my boss, the registrar, said, "John, that's a bad move. You should never organise a meeting of the Library Committee on a Wednesday afternoon." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, they're all academics." And I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, don't you know," he said, "Wednesday afternoon will break into 2 weekends for them." Well, that was a fair story 30 years ago. I don't think it's a fair story now, and I think it's increasingly so. In Africa, you'd have a different story. I think you'd have a different story now about how academics are having less and less time to run taxi firms, to run consultancies, to do things on their spare time. This, I want to emphasize, is all to the good. It shows that academia is becoming a profession that is well regarded. I think we sometimes overestimate the amount of aid that is going into academia. I only say this because last week I was at the Conference of Commonwealth Education Ministers, at which I heard, and I hear this story quite often, from the OECD figures, the tale that higher education receives as much aid as basic education in terms of international aid, and that over 75% of that higher education aid goes in scholarships. If you ever hear this story, it is a gross distortion of the facts. What actually happens is that some countries, particularly European countries, France, Germany in particular, do not charge full cost overseas tuition fees for overseas students. And when the form comes round to report the OECD aid, they add up all the difference between the subsidised tuition fee that they give to everybody and the full cost tuition fee, and lump it down as a whole area of aid, which completely distorts the figure. So let me tell you that this supposed aid, hardly any of it reaches African universities, and hardly any of it is in the Commonwealth domain as well. I just make that as a side point. Okay, so what do we know about what is happening on a day-to-day level? Well, actually, you know, I think this is an area where the community of publishers here can help us a great deal, because so much of the evidence we have is anecdotal. So much of the evidence we have about private universities in particular we know that there are some hugely impressive examples of private universities. We know actually that the very notion private university is itself a bit of a misnomer. When we talk about private universities, we tend to mean non-state universities. Within that category, there are foundations, there are non-for-profits, there are religious universities, there are commercial universities. So we need to break it down to start off with. But people have very entrenched views about this. People have entrenched views that say, well, you know, private universities don't have the same rigor, they don't have the same quality, they don't have the same range of subjects, they don't have the same emphasis on research, they don't have the same emphasis on community involvement. I've yet to see a definitive study on that, and I suspect there isn't one because, as I said, the sector is so diverse. We do know that we could not survive without the private sector in terms of absorbing the vastly increased number of students who are now qualified to go into higher education. So whereas 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the whole question that perhaps the state sector was asking is, should we encourage a private sector? That debate has moved on. Education needs a private sector now. And in some ways, I suspect in 5 or 10 years' time, there will be an emphasis on the public sector probably to answer the same kind of question that the BBC has to answer in the UK, actually. Just as the BBC is the one channel that we all pay for, we all have to pay for through our license, I suspect that in 10, 20 years, the public universities in many countries will face the same question. You know, in many countries now, the private sector is training more people than the public sector. In 10, 20 years' time, that will be true in more countries. So the question will be reversed. Not does the private sector have a legitimate role, but does the public sector provide anything distinctive that justifies its state funding? And I kind of warn our members of that. I think it does. I think some of the issues we've been talking about, quality of research, intensity of student experience, should certainly be within that category, but the public sector will have to position itself to make sure that it really does do that. A key question, though, and this is a question that actually I would love to know from the publishers assembled here, is private sector universities, new public sector universities, are they accessing journals in the same way that state universities do? That would be actually a great indicator of the propensity of those institutions to engage in research, to engage in serious teaching, maybe postgraduate teaching. Talking here not only about journal subscriptions, but accessing the free electronic journals that are available through many schemes. I think that would be an actually fascinating study that could take place, and confidence and so on, which would give us a great idea, an additional idea, about what is going on in the market. I'd also like to say something about the individual level. All too often, I think, in discussions about universities, we tend to forget that they are actually composed of individuals. And in the higher education sector, actually aggressively so. I mean, for decades, for centuries, universities have essentially been collections of individuals. So the attempts that we've seen, the necessary attempts that we've seen in the last 30 years to impose some kind of institutional framework or accountability on those individuals have sometimes met with resistance. And I think when we look at individuals, particularly in developing country universities, too many of them go below the radar, actually. We think we know what life's like to be an Asian academic or an African academic, because we will see a representative here at our meetings, we meet them at conferences, we hear them talk and so on. But actually I suspect that what you find, even in modern day universities, is that the internationally facing cohort of academics is still very much a minority. That there are people within those universities who are teaching maybe the same subjects, maybe updated subjects, year after year after year, without a lot of direct research involvement, without a lot of international involvement or conference exposure. And I actually think the performance and the motivation of those people ultimately will be as important to the success of higher education as to the internationally facing cohort that we see. So we see that we have a group like that. We don't quite know what their percentage is, but we do think that their investment is important. We also have identified particular groups. When John Hall was at the ACU, we started a batch of work on early careers academics, which I still think is critical. It's still continuing in many ways at the ACU. I'll say a bit about that in a moment. We can identify those people as being fundamental to the future. We know a lot of investment is going to them, sometimes with overseas PhDs, sometimes with less so. But their motivation, their propensity to stay in the system is absolutely vital. And we shouldn't underestimate the problems that still exist. We know from countries such as Kenya, whose national plan has a requirement for 2,000 more PhDs to accommodate the new public universities. They've gone from 7 to 22 public universities in the last couple of years. We see from Pakistan, we see from Malaysia, we see from Nigeria, we see from South Africa. All of these countries have set terribly ambitious targets to increase the number of PhDs in their universities. And I think there's a huge need for us all to think about how those targets can be met. In some cases, they won't be met, actually. In some cases, the real danger is that the PhD will be diluted in order to try and meet it. But we do have to focus, I think, attention on those targets. The countries themselves have to focus attention on how much of that extra capacity can be generated domestically, how much will need overseas experience. So there is another need. Conversely, of course, and this is why I think that your experience of new teaching methods in the private sector is so important. Constantly we hear, we hear from private sector providers an element of doubt in this debate, saying, well, actually, do you need PhDs? Do you actually need PhDs to teach 19-year-old kids basic chemistry, basic maths, basic history? Can we not do it remotely? Can we not have the Pearson system where they just tick a box and get their qualification? And these are all really quite serious issues in an expanding market. And again, I think it's an area where you can help by commenting as a group, as a profession, on how far the whole range of information is being accessed by universities and their academics, and in what form. We also know a little bit, and I'll kind of finish on this point, about what is happening at institutional level. And this, I suppose, is an area where the ACU has done a great deal of work. I suppose we kind of feel that our specialization is dealing with institutions as institutions because they are our members, they choose to join us, we're in contact with them at different levels. And there I sense that there is a huge willingness to change, a huge willingness to adapt. It is certainly constrained by history. Let's be absolutely clear, many state universities in developing countries are constrained by their history, by their administration, by their rather rigorous contract terms, by the expectations of their staff and their history. They will be slow to change, but we have to look at this over a period of 10, 20, 30, 40 years rather than a period of 5 years, I think. As an example of this, the ACU has been working for the last 4 years on a project called DRUSA. DRUSA stands for Development Research Uptake for Sub-Saharan Africa. It's funded by DFID. And what it's doing uniquely is it's helping organizations to put structures in place to support their researchers who want to make more impact out of their research. And it's a bringing together, actually, in many cases, of people that already exist, public relations officers, librarians, who in many cases have research repositories, research managers, continuing education, extension groups, and people like that, to try and make sure institutions have a strategy for helping their researchers to meet this demand for research to have more impact. And I would say, although we look at it as a project, I mentioned before that there's perhaps too much of a tendency to look at research projects as projects, time-bound, that actually we've caught a tide there where universities were very keen to work in this area before we got involved, will still be very keen to work in this area after we finish, but I think we managed to help along a process that's already happening. And I do think that universities are becoming increasingly aware of this if we give them time. So in conclusion, just a little bit about what the ACU is doing in these areas. First of all, as I said, I think our focus to a large extent is on how organizations can change. I think that's a bit of a gap in the development agenda at the moment. So therefore, we're trying to put in structures such as through the Dresser Project. Of course, we all talk about leadership being important. It's something that we do at the ACU, but I think it's something that is probably lower in our portfolio of activities than many organizations. I think many people are trying to address leadership in institutions. I slightly worry that institutional leaders in Asia and Africa are a little bit inundated by people who are holding conferences telling them how they should do their jobs, particularly when most of those people are from the United States or Europe or Britain or somewhere. So I had a note of caution there. At an individual level, I do think, and again, this is something that you will come in contact more than I do, that the kind of role that, if I can use the traditional role of librarians have tried to play in the past, will actually become more prominent in future. I say this because I know when John first did his work in libraries, when he was at the ACU, he found there was a reluctance amongst academics to recognize that librarians had a real expertise that could help individual academics. And that, I think, reflected a long-standing feeling from academics worldwide that actually non-academics were all administrators. And administrators were really all clerks. And clerks, all they did was really add pieces of paper and fill in forms. Now, I think that attitude has to change. Not only in libraries, where I think increasingly we are finding that as the role of the librarian becomes more complex, more IT-orientated, and so on, I think we're finding that academics are starting to respect that role more. I think that needs to happen throughout universities. We're calling it the kind of supportive professional. We're trying to get out of the notion that administrators do not contribute to the well-being of the institution. And we started in recent months a new course for administrators, which is absolutely designed to encourage innovative thinking at all levels. And I think that will be an important part in helping universities change their approach. I mentioned earlier that we are focusing quite a bit of our very small resource on early careers, because I actually think the extent to which the next generation, this generation, are absorbed and quickly adopt a research culture and are motivated to stay in their institutions is going to be absolutely critical to the future. And we are also focusing, again, some of our very small resource on academics who have not had international exposure before. I do come back to this point that when we look at universities and we look at the academics that we know within them, quite often we are talking about a minority of the people who actually interface with students in universities. Well, Teresa, I'm sorry I've given you a breathless run-through of issues there. I hope it's of some use, and if not, please feel free to ignore it.